It's dawn in the Colorado Rockies, August 1872. A man wakes in a lean-to shelter 12 miles from the nearest human being. He's been alone for 5 weeks. His coffee is the last of his supplies. His ammunition is running low. And around his camp, hanging from trees and smoking over a low fire, are the butchered remains of 9 elk. Today, he has to kill 3 more, maybe 4, because 15 miles away, in a mining camp called Silver Plume, 3,000 men are waiting for fresh meat. If he fails, they go hungry. If he succeeds, he earns $75 this week, more than most miners make in a month. And if a grizzly kills him while he's field dressing a carcass, nobody will find his body until the snow melts next spring. This was a real job. It existed for barely 20 years, from roughly 1865 to 1885. The men who did it were called camp meat hunters, and they were some of the toughest, most isolated workers in the American West. They hunted alone for weeks at a time in grizzly country, killing enough game to feed entire mining camps. When they succeeded, they became legends. When they failed, they starved. When they died alone. And then, in less than 5 years, the railroad brought refrigerated boxcars full of Chicago beef, and the profession vanished as if it had never existed. By the end of this story, you'll understand why almost nobody remembers these men, and why that's the most frontier story of all. Between 1859 and 1890, hundreds of mining camps exploded across the Rocky Mountains. Some had a few dozen men, others had thousands. Leadville, Colorado, reached 15,000 at its peak. Virginia City, Nevada, had 25,000. Deadwood, South Dakota, swelled to 5,000 almost overnight. These weren't towns in any traditional sense. They were temporary concentrations of men, almost entirely men, who'd come to extract wealth from the ground as quickly as possible. They lived in tents, shanties, and rough-hewn log cabins. They worked underground for 10 to 12 hours a day in conditions that killed them regularly. And when they came back to the surface, exhausted and covered in rock dust, they needed to eat. The average miner burned 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day doing hard physical labor at high altitude. A camp of 3,000 miners needed a minimum of 3,000 pounds of food daily. Flour, beans, and salt pork could be freighted in by wagon over rough mountain roads. But fresh meat, that was a different problem entirely. Before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, and before branch lines reached into the high country in the 1880s, there was no way to transport fresh meat over long distances. Beef spoiled in days during summer. Even in winter, the irregular supply meant prices were astronomical when it arrived at all. In remote camps, fresh beef could cost 50 cents per pound, equivalent to $15 per pound today. Most miners couldn't afford it, but the mountains were full of game. Elk, mule deer, bighorn sheep, and occasionally buffalo on the eastern slopes. The camps needed someone to hunt that game and bring it back, someone who could work alone for weeks at a time, someone who knew how to track, kill, butcher, and preserve meat in the wilderness, someone willing to face grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, and the constant risk of death from injury, weather, or simple bad luck. That someone was the camp meat hunter. But before we talk about the dangers these men faced, you need to understand the economics. Because the money? It was extraordinary. The arrangement was straightforward. A hunter would contract with a mining camp suppliers or with a butcher who'd set up shop near the diggings. The terms varied, but typically the hunter was paid by the pound for whatever meat he delivered. Elk brought 8 to 12 cents per pound. Deer brought 6 to 10 cents. In a good week, a skilled hunter could deliver 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of dressed meat and earn $60 to $100. To put that in perspective, underground miners made $3 to $4 per day. Surface workers made $2 to $3. A camp meat hunter, if he was good and the game was plentiful, could make more in a month than a miner made in 3. But the miner went home to a bunk and a hot meal every night. The hunter slept on the ground, often hungry, always alone, and always in danger. The work began with scouting. A hunter would establish a base camp in good game country, usually a high mountain valley with water, timber for shelter and fire, and access to the alpine meadows and forests where elk and deer fed. He'd build a lean-to or a simple log shelter, dig a fire pit, and construct a smoking rack for preserving meat. This camp might be 10, 15, even 20 miles from the nearest mining camp. It had to be remote enough that the sound of his rifle didn't scare game away, but accessible enough that he could pack meat out on horses or mules when he had enough to justify the trip. Then he hunted, every day from dawn until dark, in all weather. He'd leave camp before first light and move through the high country, reading tracks and signs, watching for movement. Elk traveled in herds and made noise. Deer were more solitary and cautious. Both were wary of predators, and a man alone stank of wood smoke and sweat. He had to hunt up wind and move carefully. When he found game, he had one shot, maybe two if he was lucky and the herd didn't bolt immediately. Black powder rifles of the 1870s were single-shot weapons that took 30 seconds or more to reload. The Sharps rifle, favored by many hunters, could drop an elk at 300 yards with a well-placed shot, but miss or only wound the animal, and it would run. Tracking a wounded elk through broken country for hours or even days wasted time and ammunition the hunter couldn't afford. A clean kill meant immediate brutal work. An adult bull elk could weigh 700 pounds, a mule deer 300. The hunter had to field dress the carcass quickly, within minutes in summer heat before the meat began to spoil. He'd slit the belly, remove the internal organs, cut away the hide if he had time, and begin sectioning the carcass into manageable pieces. And he had to do this in grizzly country. Now here's where the job became deadly. Because the money was good, but the risk. Let me tell you about the grizzlies. Grizzly bears in the 1870s were more numerous and more aggressive than the few that survive today. They had not yet learned to fear humans. The smell of fresh blood and exposed viscera could draw a grizzly from miles away. A hunter field dressing an elk was vulnerable. Crouched over his work, focused on the knife, often with his rifle leaned against a tree several feet away. More than one meat hunter was killed by a grizzly that appeared without warning while he was elbow deep in a carcass. The bears moved silently through timber, and the sound of the hunter's knife working through hide and bone masked their approach. By the time a man looked up and saw the grizzly, it was often too late to reach his weapon. Some hunters took to keeping their rifles across their laps while butchering, accepting the awkwardness as the price of survival. If he survived the butchering, he faced the backbreaking work of packing meat back to his base camp. A hunter working alone could carry maybe 80 to 100 pounds on his back. An elk yielded 400 pounds of usable meat. That meant 4 or 5 trips, covering the same ground repeatedly, exhausted, often after dark. Some hunters used pack horses or mules, but animals in grizzly country were nervous and difficult to manage. Many hunters worked on foot because it was more reliable. Back at base camp, the meat had to be preserved. In summer, that meant smoking it immediately. The hunter would hang strips of meat over a low, smoky fire, fed with green wood, usually aspen or alder, which produced thick smoke without much heat. The meat had to smoke for hours, sometimes overnight, to dry it enough that it wouldn't rot. This was tedious, sleepless work. If he dozed off and the fire went out, he'd lose the meat. If the fire flared too hot, the meat would cook instead of drying, and it wouldn't keep. In fall and winter, cold temperatures helped preserve meat, but they brought other dangers. Storms could pin a hunter in camp for days, unable to hunt. Snow made tracking easier, but traveling harder. Hypothermia and frostbite killed careless men. And if a hunter broke a leg, twisted an ankle, or suffered any injury that kept him from moving, he would die slowly in his camp, alone, with no one coming to check on him. The loneliness was its own kind of danger. 6 weeks alone in the mountains, seeing no other human, hearing no voice but his own, some men broke under the isolation. There are accounts of hunters who walked into mining camps after months in the wilderness and couldn't stop talking, their words tumbling out in a desperate flood, as if they'd stored up every thought and had to release them all at once. Others arrived silent, withdrawn, struggling to readjust to the presence of other people. One journal entry from a mining camp in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado describes a meat hunter who returned after 8 weeks in the high country with nearly 3,000 pounds of smoked elk. He delivered the meat, collected his payment, and then sat on a bench outside the assay office for 2 full days, saying nothing, staring at the mountains. On the 3rd day, he bought supplies and went back into the wilderness. He was found dead the following spring, his camp intact, plenty of supplies remaining. The cause of death was never determined, but the camp physician noted that his body showed no signs of violence or disease. Some men, it seemed, simply chose not to come back. The economics of meat hunting were brutal but simple. A skilled hunter could make exceptional money, $200 to $300 per month in peak season, equivalent to $6,000 to $9,000 today. But that money came at enormous cost. The hunter had to supply his own gear, rifles, ammunition, knives, pack animals, preserved food, blankets, cooking equipment, and tools. A quality rifle alone cost $50 to $75. Ammunition was expensive and had to be packed in by the pound. A horse or mule cost $100 to $150, and they frequently died or ran off in the mountains. After expenses, a meat hunter might clear $150 to $200 per month during the 3 to 5 month hunting season. For the rest of the year, there was no work. Game was scarce in winter and spring. Miners ate beans, salt pork, and whatever supplies had been freighted in during the previous fall. The hunters had to make their season earnings last through 8 or 9 months of unemployment. Most hunters only worked the trade for a few years before moving on to something safer or less isolating. A few made it a career, returning year after year to the same hunting territories, known by reputation in the camps they supplied. These men became legends, names recorded in mining camp journals and memoirs, though rarely with full details of their lives. Some men did this job for years, others lasted weeks. And a few? They never came back at all. One such man was known only as Buckskin Joe. He supplied meat to camps in South Park, Colorado throughout the 1860s. Accounts describe him as a former mountain man who preferred the solitude of hunting to the company of people. He was said to have killed 18 elk in a single day during the fall of 1863, a feat that made him famous across the mining district. In 1865, he was found dead in his camp, killed by a grizzly bear. His rifle was still leaned against a tree, unfired. The miners buried him where he fell and named a nearby peak in his honor, though the name has since been lost. Another hunter, identified in records only as Dutch Pete, worked the Montana gold camps in the 1870s. He was a German immigrant who spoke broken English and hunted year-round, even in winter, which most others considered suicidal. He survived at least 3 grizzly attacks. Camp accounts describe horrific scars on his chest and arms. He accumulated enough money to buy a ranch in the Bitterroot Valley and retired from hunting in 1878. He was one of the few who survived the profession long enough to leave it on his own terms. The most famous meat hunter was probably James Capen Adams, better known as Grizzly Adams. Adams hunted throughout the Sierra Nevada in California during the 1850s, supplying mining camps and eventually capturing and training grizzly bears, an enterprise that seems insane by any standard. He suffered repeated mauling, but continued working until infected wounds from bear attacks finally killed him in 1860. His story became legend, heavily embellished in dime novels, and eventually inspired a 1970s television series that bore almost no resemblance to the real man's brutal, desperate life. These were not romantic figures. They were hard men doing hard work for hard money in conditions that broke most who tried. They lived alone, worked alone, and often died alone. The mining camps depended on them completely, but the relationship was purely transactional. When a hunter delivered meat, he was paid. When he failed to deliver, someone else took the contract. When he died, his body was recovered if convenient, buried if found, or left to the elements if the effort of retrieval seemed excessive. And then, almost overnight, everything changed. One invention ended the profession completely. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the east and west coasts. Throughout the 1870s and early 1880s, branch lines pushed into mining country, the Denver and Rio Grande reaching Leadville in 1880, the Northern Pacific reaching Montana in 1883. With the railroads came a revolution that no one had fully anticipated: refrigerated boxcars. The first primitive refrigerated cars appeared in the 1870s, using ice harvested from frozen lakes and packed around meat in insulated compartments. By the 1880s, the technology had improved dramatically. Beef could be slaughtered in Chicago, loaded into refrigerated cars, and shipped across the country, arriving fresh in mountain mining camps within days. It was consistent, predictable, and cheaper than wild game. Camp meat that had sold for 8 to 12 cents per pound suddenly faced competition from railroad beef selling for 6 to 8 cents per pound. The railroads could deliver year-round, in any weather, in any quantity. They didn't depend on game populations, hunting skill, or the willingness of solitary men to risk their lives in grizzly country. Within 5 years of the railroads reaching the major mining districts, the camp meat hunter had become obsolete. The contracts dried up. The butchers who'd bought wild game switched to railroad beef. The hunters, many of whom had no other skills and no desire to work any other way, found themselves stranded. Some adapted. A few became hunting guides, leading wealthy sportsmen into the mountains on trophy hunts. Others hired on as ranch hands or freighters. A handful opened small businesses in the mining camps they had supplied: saloons, hotels, or supply stores funded by their years of accumulated earnings. But many simply disappeared back into the mountains. There are accounts of meat hunters who, faced with the end of their profession, took their rifles and their gear and walked back into the wilderness, never to return. Whether they died there or simply chose to live out their remaining years in isolation, away from the civilization that no longer needed them, no one knows. Their camps were occasionally found years later: cold fire pits, collapsed shelters, rusted tools, and bones scattered by animals. The profession that had seemed essential for 20 years vanished so completely that within a generation, no one remembered it had existed. The miners who'd eaten the game those hunters provided moved on to new camps or went home. The mining camps themselves, many of them, collapsed as the ore played out. The mountains returned to wilderness, and the stories of the men who'd hunted there alone were lost. Today, there are no monuments to the camp meat hunter, no museums dedicated to preserving their tools or telling their stories. In the archives of historical societies in Colorado, Montana, and California, you can find occasional references in mining camp journals, terse entries recording payments for meat delivered, or brief notes about a hunter who'd gone missing. A few photographs survive, showing lean, weathered men in buckskin clothing, holding rifles, staring at the camera with expressions that suggest they'd rather be anywhere else. They were an essential part of the mining frontier's infrastructure, as necessary as the assayers, the freighters, and the engineers. They fed thousands. They worked in conditions that would be considered unthinkable today. And they did it because the money was good, because they preferred isolation to companionship, or because they had no other choice. For 20 years, they existed in the space between wilderness and civilization, too far from towns to be part of society, but too necessary to the camps to be completely wild. They were the last echo of the mountain men who'd preceded them, and the first victims of the industrial efficiency that would tame the frontier. The camp meat hunter, a profession so brief that history barely noticed it, a job so dangerous that most men refused to try it, and a way of life so isolated that when it ended, the men who'd lived it simply faded back into the mountains they'd known better than any town. They fed the miners who dug the silver and gold that built the West, and when the railroads made them unnecessary, they disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only a few scattered records and the knowledge that for a brief moment, in the highest, loneliest places in America, there were men who hunted alone to feed thousands. The last documented camp meat hunter worked in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado in 1887. His name was not recorded. He delivered his final load of meat to a camp near Silverton in September of that year, collected his payment, and was never seen again. By then, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was already running regular freight service to the region, and fresh beef from the stockyards arrived weekly. His profession had lasted exactly one generation, long enough to seem permanent, brief enough that its disappearance left almost no mark on history. And that, perhaps, is the most frontier story of all, a way of life that existed because circumstances demanded it, flourished because men were desperate or skilled or crazy enough to do the work, and vanished the moment technology offered a better solution. The mountains are still there. The elk still graze in the high meadows. But the men who hunted them alone, who fed the camps, who lived and died in isolation to make the mining frontier possible, they're gone. And almost no one remembers they were ever there at all. That's what makes this the perfect frontier story. Not because it was romantic, not because it was heroic, but because it was essential, brutal, brief, and then forgotten completely. Just like the men who lived it.